On the morning of February 17, 1945, Lieutenant Colonel Takechi Nishi descended 75 feet into the volcanic rock of Iwo Jima through a shaft so precisely engineered that its walls showed chisel marks in parallel lines. The Baron, as his men still called him, though he discouraged it, paused at the junction where Tunnel Complex 14 branched into 3 separate arteries, each disappearing into darkness that swallowed the beam of his flashlight after 20 meters. Above him, 22,000 Japanese soldiers waited in a subterranean city that had taken 8 months and 300,000 man-days to carve from the sulphurous bowels of Mount Suribachi and the island's central plateau. Nishi placed his palm against the cool stone. 18 inches of solid volcanic rock overhead, in some sectors 30 feet, reinforced concrete blast doors at critical junctions, ventilation shafts angled to deflect flame and gas, multiple exits from every fighting position, water cisterns, ammunition magazines, a hospital with surgical bays 100 feet below the surface where American bombs would sound like distant thunder. "The Americans will bomb for days," Nishi remarked to Captain Samaji Inoue, who had overseen the tunneling of this sector. "They will believe they have destroyed everything. They will land expecting corpses." He gestured toward the firing aperture above them, a slit barely 8 inches wide that commanded 400 meters of beach. "And they will discover we have been waiting for them. Underground, untouched, patient." Inoue permitted himself a rare smile. Before the war, he had been a mining engineer in Hokkaido. He had spent his career studying how rock failed, where seams weakened, how water found cracks. He had designed Complex 14 to answer every method of destruction the Americans might attempt. Naval guns, the oblique angles of the corridors would channel blast pressure harmlessly through the system. Aerial bombs, even a direct hit from a 2,000-pound bomb penetrated only 12 feet of this rock, and they were deeper. Grenades, the L-shaped entry passages created blast traps. Gas, the ventilation system could be sealed in 17 separate sections. "They will throw everything they have at this island," Inoue said, "and when they are finished, when they have spent their ammunition and exhausted their ships, they will still have to come inside, man against man, rifle against rifle, and in these tunnels their numbers mean nothing." What Colonel Nishi could not know, what neither he, nor Inoue, nor General Kuribayashi himself could have imagined, was that the Americans had already begun to understand. Not everything. Not yet. But across the Pacific, in a dozen bloody laboratories called Peleliu, Saipan, and Biak, a new American doctrine was being written in flame, literally in flame. The caves were not impenetrable. They were tombs. The Japanese had simply built them for the wrong occupants. The Japanese faith in fortified caves was not superstition. It was doctrine born from mathematics, geology, and the hard lessons of 2 years of island warfare. By late 1944, Imperial General Headquarters had abandoned the strategy of beach defense, the catastrophic doctrine that had seen garrison after garrison obliterated by American naval gunfire before a single Marine set foot on sand. Saipan had been the final education. There, Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito had positioned his forces to contest the waterline, and American battleships had methodically disassembled his defenses from 14,000 yards offshore, 16-inch shells traveling faster than sound, positions that had taken months to construct, erased in hours. Saito died in a final banzai charge, his strategy already a corpse before he was. The new doctrine came directly from Tokyo, stamped with the authority of the Army General Staff. Fukaku, underground fortification, defense in depth. Let the Americans have the beaches. Let them advance into prepared kill zones. Bleed them in terrain where ships and aircraft could not follow. The mathematics seemed irrefutable. Colonel Tadamichi Kuribayashi, assigned to transform Iwo Jima into a fortress, calculated that American naval guns could neutralize any surface position within 72 hours of concentrated bombardment. But volcanic rock absorbed punishment differently. At a depth of 20 feet, a 500-pound bomb's blast pressure dropped to less than 15% of its surface impact. At 30 feet, the concussion became negligible. A shudder felt through the soles of one's boots. Nothing more. Kuribayashi ordered his engineers to dig deeper than 30 feet wherever possible. "We will make the Americans pay with 10 of their men for every one of ours," Kuribayashi wrote to his wife in December 1944. "The island will be our fortress, but the fortress will be beneath the island. They cannot bomb what they cannot see. They cannot shell what they cannot reach." The engineering was meticulous. Japanese military doctrine had studied cave fortifications since the 1930s, drawing on expertise from the Manchurian campaign and the mountainous terrain of China. Major Masao Hayashi, chief engineering officer on Iwo Jima, had written his thesis at the Imperial Army Engineering School on blast dissipation in tunnel systems. He designed corridors that turned at precise angles, never 90 degrees, which created pressure traps, but 120-degree bends that channeled explosive force harmlessly through the network. Ventilation shafts rose through multiple chambers, each acting as a baffle to filter out gas and flame. Entrances were concealed with camouflage nets woven from native vegetation, then covered with a thin layer of volcanic sand that would appear undisturbed even after bombardment. By February 1945, Iwo Jima contained 11 miles of tunnels connecting 1,500 rooms. Some chambers held 20 men. Others stored artillery pieces on rails that could be rolled forward to firing apertures, discharged and withdrawn into the mountain before American spotters could fix their position. The hospital complex beneath Mount Suribachi contained surgical theaters, recovery wards, and enough medical supplies for 400 casualties. Cisterns held 120,000 gallons of water. Rice stores could sustain the garrison for 3 months without resupply. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, commanding the amphibious assault, estimated the pre-invasion bombardment would require 10 days to neutralize Iwo Jima's defenses. He was given 72 hours of naval gunfire and aerial bombing that churned the surface of the island into a moonscape of craters and ash. Beneath the bombardment, in tunnels that trembled but held, 22,000 Japanese soldiers waited. They cleaned their rifles. They wrote final letters. They listened to the thunder overhead and understood it for what it was: impotent rage. American shells were burying themselves in empty rock, expending their fury against volcanic stone that had endured eruptions for millennia. The Americans would have to come down eventually, and that was where the mathematics favored the defenders. The American answer to the cave problem began not in a laboratory or a war room, but in a Massachusetts factory that had once manufactured industrial heating equipment. In the spring of 1940, the Chemical Warfare Service approached the E.I. DuPont de Nemours Company and the Standard Oil Development Company with a problem that had haunted military planners since the trenches of 1918: how to make fire stick. The flamethrowers of the Great War had been unwieldy, unreliable, and their fuel, raw gasoline, splashed off surfaces and burned too quickly to penetrate fortifications. Against the concrete bunkers that German engineers were already constructing along the Atlantic coast, American war planners knew gasoline would be insufficient. The man who solved the problem was a 34-year-old Harvard chemist named Louis Fieser. Slight, bespectacled, and prone to speaking in chemical formulae even at dinner parties, Fieser had made his reputation synthesizing vitamin K. Now the Army wanted him to synthesize something considerably less therapeutic. The military wanted a fuel that would cling, Fieser wrote in his laboratory notes dated February 14, 1942. That would burn hot and long. That would flow into spaces where men might hide and convince them with absolute finality to stop hiding. Fieser's breakthrough came from an unlikely source: the naphthenic and palmitic acids used in soap production. Mixed with gasoline in precise proportions, these acids transformed liquid fuel into a gel, a viscous, sticky substance that adhered to surfaces, resisted extinguishing, and burned at temperatures exceeding 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. Fieser called his creation napalm, a portmanteau of its chemical components. The Army called it the future of incendiary warfare. But napalm was merely fuel. Delivering it required a weapon, and here the Chemical Warfare Service turned to the M1A1 flamethrower, a cumbersome backpack system that had proven marginally effective in North Africa and Italy. The M1A1 could project burning fuel roughly 45 feet, enough to clear a machine gun nest, but woefully inadequate against the deep cave systems intelligence reports indicated the Japanese were constructing across the Pacific. The redesign fell to engineers at the Chemical Warfare Services Development Facility in Gruinard, working alongside the newly established Pacific Warfare Board in Hawaii. Their mandate was simple: more range, more fuel, more burn time. The result was the M2-2 flamethrower, fielded in late 1944. Its specifications read like a pyromaniac's wish list. Fuel capacity increased to 4 gallons. Effective range extended to 65 feet with the new thickened fuel. Burn time of 8 continuous seconds per tank. Yet even the M2-2 had limitations that became apparent in the cave-riddled terrain of Peleliu. 8 seconds was not enough. 65 feet could not reach the deepest recesses where Japanese defenders waited, and a man carrying 70 pounds of fuel on his back made an irresistible target. One rifle round through the tank, and he became a human torch. The solution emerged from the Marine Corps' own desperation. On Peleliu, engineers from the 1st Marine Division began mounting flamethrowers on M4 Sherman tanks, replacing the hull-mounted .30 caliber machine gun with a flame projector fed by a 300-gallon fuel tank installed where ammunition storage had been. The weapon could project napalm 150 feet, twice the range of any portable system, and the tank's armor protected the operator from the small arms fire that made carrying a backpack flamethrower a death sentence. The Marines called them Ronson tanks, after the cigarette lighter that advertised itself as lighting every time. The Japanese would come to call them something else entirely: Keian Sensha, flame tanks, or, in the whispered vernacular of men who had seen them in action, the breath of the demon. "We knew flamethrowers existed," Colonel Kurabayashi wrote in his final tactical assessment, dated January 1945. "We had designed our ventilation systems to dissipate their effects. What we had not anticipated was the scale. We prepared for torches. They brought rivers of fire." The first Ronson tanks arrived at Iwo Jima aboard LSTs on D+2, February 21, 1945. 8 vehicles from the 5th Tank Battalion, their crews trained in Hawaii on mock-up cave systems built to Japanese specifications recovered from Peleliu. The mathematics of the caves was about to be recalculated. The flame tanks arrived on Iwo Jima as saviors. Within 72 hours, they had become coffins. The problem was not the weapon, it was the terrain and the Japanese understanding of it. The volcanic sand of Iwo Jima's beaches had the consistency of a tight powder, concealing a substrate that swallowed vehicles whole. On D+1, 2 Shermans from the 4th Tank Battalion sank to their turrets within 200 yards of the water line. Their crews extracted under mortar fire that killed 3 men. The Ronson tanks, heavier by 2,000 pounds due to their fuel loads, fared worse. Of the 8 flame tanks landed on February 21st, 3 were immobilized before reaching their first objective. Sergeant First Class William "Red" Hannigan commanded the lead Ronson of the 5th Tank Battalion's flame platoon. His war diary, recovered after his death on D+14, recorded the early disasters with the terse precision of a man too exhausted for elaboration. February 22nd, Ronson 3 through a track in grid square 162. Crew attempted repair under fire. Fuel tank punctured by knee mortar fragment. Burns to CPL Weston, PFC Alvarado. Vehicle abandoned. February 23rd, Ronson 7 direct hit from 47mm AT gun, Motoyama area, complete loss, 4 KIA. February 24th, my vehicle, flame gun malfunction at Cave 14C, fuel pressure failure, withdrew under small arms fire, 3 hits to hull, no penetration. Flame system inoperative 6 hours for repair. The Japanese had prepared for the flame tanks with the same methodical precision they had applied to every other American weapon. Intelligence officers on Iwo Jima had studied captured M4 Shermans from Saipan and identified the Ronson variant's vulnerability, the external fuel line running from the rear-mounted tank to the hull projector. A single rifle round in the right location would not ignite the napalm. It was too thick to combust without pressurization, but would render the weapon useless. Japanese defensive doctrine, updated in January 1945, designated flame tanks as priority targets for 47mm anti-tank guns and suicide demolition squads. Captain Inui's engineering reports noted with satisfaction that 3 flame tanks had been disabled in the first week without significant employment against prepared positions. The American fire-breathing tanks are fearsome in concept, wrote Lieutenant Satoshi Okazaki of the 145th Infantry Regiment in a letter dated February 26th, never sent, found on his body 2 weeks later. But they are clumsy, slow. They cannot traverse our terrain, and when they become stuck, they are targets. We have destroyed several already. Our caves remain untouched. The Americans burn the air outside our doors, but they cannot reach us where we wait. The mockery extended beyond Iwo Jima. Radio Tokyo, in a broadcast monitored by American intelligence on March 1st, described the flame tanks as desperate American barbarism that had failed utterly to dislodge our heroic defenders from their island fortress. The broadcast claimed with some accuracy that Japanese casualties from flame weapons in the first 10 days of fighting were minimal compared to the thousands of American dead accumulating on the Black Beaches. Within the American command, doubts festered. Rear Admiral Harry Hill, commanding the gunfire support group, questioned whether the flame tanks justified their logistical burden. Each vehicle required dedicated LST space and specialized fuel resupply that could have carried conventional ammunition. Major General Graves Erskine of the 3rd Marine Division noted in his operational log that flame tank support had been inconsistent and mechanically unreliable through the first week of fighting. The statistics seemed damning. By March 1st, 5 of the original 8 Ronson tanks were out of action, 3 destroyed, 2 undergoing repairs that required parts not available on the island. The remaining 3 had expended over 4,000 gallons of napalm. Confirmed Japanese casualties from flame attacks, fewer than 200. Cost per enemy killed, approximately 20 gallons of specialized fuel, plus the lives of 11 tank crewmen. Colonel Grubel, commanding officer of the 5th Tank Battalion, faced pressure from above to reallocate his remaining flame tanks to conventional gun duties. The M4's 75mm cannon, after all, could fire all day without resupply concerns. What good was a Dragon that spent more time broken down than breathing fire? What the statistics did not capture, what no report yet reflected, was that the Americans were learning. Each failed attack on a cave complex revealed something about Japanese defensive architecture. Each malfunction led to field modifications that would never appear in any technical manual, and in the smoldering aftermath of every engagement, infantry officers were beginning to understand something that would transform the final 3 weeks of the battle. The caves were not impenetrable, they were sealed systems, and sealed systems, when filled with fire, became ovens. March 8th, 1945. Grid Square 183, Northern Iwo Jima, Hill 362C. Staff Sergeant Raymond Coletti had not slept in 31 hours. His Ronson tank, nicknamed Hellcat by a crew that had already buried 2 of its original members, idled 40 yards from a cave entrance that had killed 7 Marines from Fox Company in the past 6 hours. The aperture was barely visible, a shadow in the volcanic rock, perhaps 4 feet wide, positioned to provide enfilading fire across the entire northern approach to the hill. Every assault had been driven back by a Type 92 heavy machine gun that the Japanese crew rolled forward, fired in disciplined bursts, then withdrew into the darkness before American mortars could bracket the position. What made Hill 362C different from the dozens of cave complexes Coletti had engaged in the previous 2 weeks was not the enemy's skill. It was Lieutenant Paul Grunewald, a combat engineer from the 5th Pioneer Battalion who had spent the night studying a captured Japanese tunnel diagram from a different sector. "The ventilation," Grunewald said, crouching beside Coletti's tank in the pre-dawn darkness. He traced his finger across the diagram, smudged with ash and someone else's blood. "They all connect, not just the fighting positions, the living quarters, the supply rooms, the aid stations. The Japanese built these things like ant colonies. One entrance here," he tapped the cave mouth that had been killing his men, "but the air has to go somewhere. There have to be other openings." Coletti understood immediately. For 2 weeks, flame tanks had been attacking cave mouths directly. pumping napalm into apertures designed specifically to deflect and dissipate such attacks. The L-shaped corridors, the blast baffles, the segmented ventilation systems, every feature Captain Inouye had designed to defeat the flamethrower was oriented toward the obvious point of attack, the front door. But what if you didn't use the front door? It took 3 hours to locate them. 3 small fissures in the rock face, 200 yards uphill from the main entrance, each barely 18 inches wide. Natural volcanic vents that the Japanese had incorporated into their ventilation system. Too small for a man to enter, too small for a grenade to penetrate effectively, not too small for a tongue of pressurized napalm. At 0847, Coletti positioned Hellcat beside the uppermost vent. The hull-mounted flame projector could not angle upward sufficiently to reach it, so Private First Class Anthony Morial dismounted with an M2-2 portable unit, climbing the rocks with 70 pounds of fuel on his back, while Japanese rifle fire snapped off the stone around him. Coletti provided suppressing fire with the tank's .50 caliber, stitching the main cave entrance to keep the machine gun crew occupied. Morial reached the vent at 0853. He did not hesitate. 6 seconds of continuous fire, the napalm stream disappearing into the black fissure like water down a drain. For a moment, nothing. Then the screaming began. What happened inside Hill 362C would be reconstructed later from the testimony of a single survivor. Superior Private Kenji Yamamoto, captured 4 days later, burned over 40% of his body, who had been positioned near a secondary exit 300 yards from the point of attack. The napalm, Yamamoto explained through an interpreter, had not simply entered the cave. It had traveled. The pressurized gel flowed downward through the ventilation channels, clinging to walls and ceilings, filling corridor after corridor with fire that consumed every molecule of oxygen in its path. Men who were not touched by flame suffocated within minutes. Men who were touched by flame did not suffocate. They burned. The fire came from above, Yamamoto whispered, his eyes fixed on something the interpreter could not see. From the air itself. We had prepared for attacks from the entrances. We had not prepared for the sky to fall inside the mountain. Coletti's crew repeated the attack at the second vent, then the third. Each 6-second burst sent another river of fire coursing through the tunnel network. At 9:14, the main cave entrance, the 4-foot aperture that had stopped 7 marine assaults, vomited a column of black smoke and orange flame that rose 40 feet into the morning air. The Type 92 machine gun did not fire again. When combat engineers entered Hill 362-C 3 hours later, they counted 147 Japanese bodies in the first 200 yards of tunnel. Some were burned beyond recognition. Others showed no visible injuries. Their lungs had simply ceased to function when the temperature inside the sealed corridors exceeded 500 degrees. In the deepest chamber, 180 feet from any entrance, they found the body of a Japanese officer still seated at a field desk. A half-written letter before him, his pen still in his hand. The ink had boiled in its reservoir. Fox Company had taken Hill 362C in 4 hours. They had expected 4 days. Word spread through the Marine divisions that night with the speed of desperate hope. The caves could be broken, not from the front. From above, from behind, from the ventilation systems the Japanese had designed to keep their defenders alive. The very engineering that made the tunnels survivable made them vulnerable. Every connecting corridor became a highway for flame. Every sealed blast door became the wall of a crematorium. On the evening of March 8th, Colonel Grubel received a request from the 3rd Marine Division for every available flame tank. The same commanders who had questioned the weapon's value 2 weeks earlier now demanded its immediate deployment. The mathematics had changed. And in the tunnel still held by Japanese forces across northern Iwo Jima, 8,000 defenders waited in darkness, not yet understanding that their fortresses had become traps. The doctrine spread faster than the flames themselves. By March 10th, every Marine infantry battalion on Iwo Jima had received mimeographed copies of Lieutenant Grunewald's tactical report, hastily typed and distributed under the heading Cave Reduction via Ventilation Infiltration. The document was 3 pages long. It would save thousands of American lives. It would end thousands of Japanese ones. The formula was brutally simple. Locate the cave mouth. Do not attack it. Instead, fan out. Search the surrounding terrain for fissures, cracks, secondary openings, any aperture connected to the tunnel system's air supply. Mark them with white phosphorus grenades for visibility. Then bring up the Ronsons. What had taken Coletti's crew 4 hours of improvisation on March 8th became standardized procedure by March 12th. Flame tank platoons operated in coordination with combat engineers who carried captured Japanese tunnel diagrams and, increasingly, their own hand-drawn maps compiled from interrogations of the shell-shocked prisoners now surrendering in numbers that would have been unthinkable 2 weeks earlier. Each cave complex was approached as a puzzle to be solved, not a fortress to be stormed. The results were immediate and catastrophic. On March 11th, elements of the 21st Marines reduced a fortified position in the Motoyama Plateau that intelligence had estimated would require 48 hours of fighting. The complex contained an estimated 340 Japanese troops in 17 interconnected chambers. Engineers located 4 ventilation points. 4 Ronson tanks fired simultaneously. The engagement lasted 11 minutes. When demolition teams sealed the main entrance the following morning, they could hear nothing from inside. No voices, no movement. The silence of mass extinction. The Japanese called it Jigoku no Kaze, the wind from hell. Major Toshiharu Masuda, commanding the remnants of the 145th Infantry Regiment from a command post beneath Hill 382, attempted to implement countermeasures. His orders, recovered after the battle, reveal the desperation of a man watching his carefully constructed defenses become instruments of his soldiers' annihilation. All ventilation apertures must be sealed immediately with available materials: soil, rock, clothing, bodies of the fallen if necessary. The Americans have discovered our weakness. We must deny them the air channels, or we will suffocate in our own fortifications. Each squad is to designate 2 men for continuous ventilation watch. Any opening that cannot be sealed must be defended with rifle fire, regardless of ammunition constraints. The orders were futile. The ventilation systems could not be sealed without suffocating the defenders themselves. The very air that kept 200 men alive in a subterranean chamber had to come from somewhere. Masuda was asking his soldiers to choose between death by flame and death by asphyxiation. Many chose a third option. Surrender rates, which had averaged fewer than 5 prisoners per day through the first 2 weeks of battle, rose to 30 per day by March 15th. 40 per day by March 18th. Those who did not surrender died in ways that defied the imagination of men who thought they had already seen everything war could offer. Private First Class Harold Oberman, a flame tank gunner with the 4th Tank Battalion, described the reduction of Cushman's pocket in a letter to his brother dated March 20th, 1945. There was a cave system the Japs had been using as a hospital. We knew because we could hear them, the wounded I mean, screaming. The corpsman said there might be 200 men inside, maybe more. The skipper found 3 vents on the back slope. We fired into all 3. I don't know how long we held the triggers. Long enough that my fuel gauge dropped by half. When we stopped, the screaming stopped too. Not all at once. It took a few minutes. Then there was just this sound. Like wind through a pipe organ, the lieutenant said. Hot air escaping. We didn't go inside. Nobody wanted to go inside. They sealed it with demolition charges the next day. The chaplain said a prayer, but I don't think anyone was listening, not even God. The transformation in Japanese morale was visible in the documents they left behind. Lieutenant Satoshi Okazaki, the same officer who had dismissed the flame tanks as clumsy in his February 26th letter, wrote again on March 14th. This letter, too, was never sent. They do not fight as men fight. They send fire through the stone itself. Corporal Hayashi was 20 meters from the nearest entrance when the flames found him. 20 meters inside solid rock. There was nowhere to run. The tunnel filled with fire from both directions, and he burned standing upright because there was no room to fall. I watched through the communication passage. I could not reach him. I could not help him. I could only watch him burn and listen to him scream my name and know that the same death is waiting for me in this tomb we built with our own hands. Okazaki died on March 19th. His body was found in a collapsed tunnel section, unburned. He had shot himself. By the 3rd week of March, the cave systems that had been designed to shelter 22,000 men had become a liability so severe that surviving Japanese officers began ordering their troops to abandon the tunnels entirely. Colonel Masuo Ikeda, commanding the shattered remnants of the 2nd Mixed Brigade, issued instructions on March 21st for his remaining 800 soldiers to conduct surface operations only, fighting from shell craters and natural depressions rather than the elaborate fortifications that had taken 8 months to construct. "The tunnels are no longer defensible," Ikeda wrote. "They are crematoria. Any man who enters them is already dead. We will fight in the open, where American fire cannot trap us. We will die in the sunlight, not in the darkness underground." It was not a tactical adaptation. It was an admission of absolute defeat. The weapon the Japanese had believed would neutralize American technological superiority, the caves themselves, had been turned against them so completely that open ground, exposed to naval gunfire and aerial bombardment, was now considered safer than the fortresses they had spent the better part of a year constructing. The Marines advanced 3 times faster in the final week of fighting than they had in the first, and still the Ronsons kept coming. 14 flame tanks operational by March 23rd, reinforced by replacement ship from Hawaii. They moved across the island in pairs, accompanied by infantry who no longer feared the caves that had haunted their nightmares since D-Day. The tanks would approach a hill, engineers would study the terrain, vents would be located, fire would descend, then silence. Then the next hill. The numbers told a story that no narrative could capture, and yet demanded one be told. Between February 19th and March 26, 1945, American flame weapons on Iwo Jima consumed 247,000 gallons of napalm. Ronson tanks alone expended 168,000 gallons, enough to fill the fuel tanks of 560 B-29 bombers. Portable M2-2 flamethrowers accounted for another 79,000 gallons, carried into battle on the backs of men who knew that a single bullet could transform them into human torches. The cost in American lives was grievous. 42 flame tank crewmen killed, 67 wounded. Portable flamethrower operators suffered a 92% casualty rate, the highest of any specialty on the island. The cost in Japanese lives was annihilation. Official Marine Corps estimates attributed 8,493 confirmed enemy deaths directly to flame weapons, 38% of all Japanese killed on Iwo Jima. But this figure, compiled from after-action reports and body counts, captured only what could be seen and verified. It did not include the sealed caves, the collapsed tunnels, the chambers that were never entered because the stench of incinerated flesh made approach impossible. Colonel Joseph Alexander, in his operational analysis completed in August 1945, estimated the true figure at no fewer than 12,000 and possibly exceeding 15,000, more than 2/3 of the island's entire garrison. The caves that Captain Inouye had designed to shelter 22,000 men became tombs for the majority of them. Post-war interrogations, conducted at processing centers across Hawaii, Guam, and the Japanese home islands, revealed the psychological devastation that accompanied the physical destruction. Major Yoshitaka Hori, a staff officer who had helped plan Iwo Jima's defenses and was among the fewer than 1,100 Japanese survivors taken prisoner, provided testimony at Fleet Marine Force Pacific headquarters in September 1945. "We believed the caves made us invincible. This was our doctrine. This was our faith. We calculated the thickness of rock required to defeat every American weapon. We measured the angles necessary to deflect blast pressure. We trained our soldiers to endure bombardment that would have destroyed any surface position. And then the Americans did not attack our positions. They attacked the air we breathed. They filled our fortresses with fire, and we died in the shelters we had built to protect us. It was not a defeat. It was an inversion. Everything we believed would save us became the instrument of our destruction." Hori's testimony continued for 11 hours across 3 sessions. He wept twice. The transcribing officer noted that he refused water during breaks, as if denying himself the element that might have quenched the flames that still burned behind his eyes. Superior Private Kenji Yamamoto, the burn survivor from Hill 362C who had witnessed the first successful ventilation attack, was interviewed at Tripler Army Hospital in Honolulu while recovering from skin grafts in July 1945. His statement, recorded by Lieutenant Commander Marcus Webb of Naval Intelligence, became a classified reference document for cave reduction tactics in the planned invasion of Japan. Before the fire came, we pitied the Americans. They had to cross open beaches. They had to climb hills where we waited. They died by the hundreds, and we watched from our apertures and believed we could not be touched. After the fire came, I understood that we were the ones to be pitied. We had buried ourselves. We had sealed ourselves in stone and waited for the Americans to pour death through the cracks. Every tunnel we dug was a grave. We simply did not know we were digging our own graves until the flames filled them. The psychological assessment appended to Yamamoto's file noted that he exhibited profound dissociative symptoms consistent with complete worldview collapse, and recommended against repatriation to Japan until psychiatric stabilization could be achieved. Perhaps the most haunting testimony came not from an interrogation room, but from a memorial ceremony. In 1972, the Japanese government organized a pilgrimage of Iwo Jima veterans to the island for a reconciliation service attended by both Japanese and American survivors. Takeshi Maeda, who had served as a signals corporal in the 145th Infantry Regiment and was one of only 17 men from his 200-man company to survive, addressed the assembly in remarks later published in the Asahi Shimbun. I have walked these hills today, and I cannot find the cave where I spent 40 days in 1945. It has been sealed, collapsed, buried. I do not know if my comrades are still inside. I do not know if anyone has ever recovered their remains. I suspect not. I suspect they are still there, in the darkness, in tunnels that became furnaces. We were told the caves would protect us. We were told the Americans could bomb for 100 days and we would emerge to fight. No one told us about the fire that would come through the vents. No one warned us that the stone would become an oven and we would cook inside it like rice. When I close my eyes, I still hear them. Not screaming. By the end, there was no air left to scream. Just the sound of men trying to breathe when there was nothing left to breathe. A wet, choking sound. I have heard it every night for 27 years. The Marine Corps' final assessment of flame weapons on Iwo Jima, compiled in April 1945, concluded with an observation that would shape American tactical doctrine for the next 3 decades. The cave fortifications encountered on Iwo Jima represented the most sophisticated defensive engineering yet faced by American forces in the Pacific Theater. These positions were designed with full knowledge of American capabilities and were believed by the enemy to be impervious to all conventional assault methods. The systematic employment of flame weapons, particularly through ventilation infiltration tactics developed in the field, reduced these impregnable positions, with casualties averaging 87% lower than projected for conventional assault. The flamethrower has proven to be not merely a weapon of terror, but a weapon of decisive tactical utility against fortified positions. Its employment should be considered mandatory in all future operations involving cave or tunnel reduction. The doctrine would be implemented on Okinawa within weeks. It would be planned for the invasion of Japan itself, Operation Downfall, where intelligence estimated that Japanese cave fortifications would exceed those of Iwo Jima by a factor of 20. The atomic bombs fell before that invasion became necessary, but the plans existed. The flame tanks were ready, and in the caves of Kyushu and Honshu, hundreds of thousands of Japanese soldiers waited in fortifications they believed would protect them, never knowing that the Americans had already learned how to fill the darkness with fire. On the morning of March 21st, 1945, a Marine patrol from the 28th Regiment discovered an entrance to Tunnel Complex 14, the same labyrinth where Lieutenant Colonel Takechi Nishi had stood 5 weeks earlier, palm pressed against cool volcanic stone, confident that American bombs would sound like distant thunder above his impregnable fortress. The Baron was still inside. His body was never recovered. Japanese sources suggest he died sometime around March 22nd, likely from wounds sustained in fighting near the northern coast. Some accounts claim he took his own life. Others indicate he led a final night attack and was killed by American machine gun fire. The truth disappeared into the tunnels with him. What the Marines found in Complex 14 told its own story. 17 chambers, connected by corridors that still showed Captain Inuye's precise chisel marks on their walls. Ventilation shafts angled exactly as designed to deflect flame and gas. Blast doors intact. L-shaped entry passages that should have neutralized any explosive force. None of it had mattered. The complex had been reduced 3 days earlier via 2 ventilation fissures located 340 meters from the main entrance. The Marines who entered reported that the deepest chambers, the ones Inouye had designed to survive direct hits from 2,000-pound bombs, contained the highest concentration of bodies. 112 men had died in a space designed to shelter them from anything the Americans could deliver. They had not died from blast or fragmentation or concussion. They had died because the air itself had become poison, because the stone walls they trusted had conducted heat like the walls of a kiln, because the engineering that sealed them away from American firepower had sealed them in with American fire. Captain Samaji Inouye was among them. The mining engineer from Hokkaido, who had spent his career studying how rock failed, had built his masterpiece and died inside it. His body was identified by the rank insignia fused to what remained of his collar. "They will throw everything they have at this island," Inouye had said on that February morning, standing beside Colonel Nishi in the tunnel junction he had designed. "And when they are finished, they will still have to come inside, man against man, rifle against rifle, and in these tunnels, their numbers mean nothing." He had been wrong about everything except the last sentence. In the tunnels, numbers meant nothing. Not Japanese numbers, not American numbers. Only fire mattered. Only the simple, terrible physics of combustion in an enclosed space. Only the truth that had been waiting in the volcanic rock since the first chisel strike. That a fortress with no escape is not a fortress at all. The caves of Iwo Jima were never impenetrable. They were sealed chambers in which 22,000 men had voluntarily imprisoned themselves, trusting in stone and engineering and doctrine to protect them from an enemy who had learned to turn protection into annihilation. Lieutenant Colonel Nishi had placed his palm against the cool rock and felt safety. He should have felt a coffin lid. The Japanese built their caves to wait out the storm. They calculated angles and depths and thicknesses with the precision of men who believed war was a problem of engineering. They created an underground empire designed to answer every weapon in the American arsenal. And the Americans answered with the one thing the engineers had never imagined. They didn't try to break through the stone. They simply filled it with fire and let the caves do the rest.